Welcome to the Purpose for Life podcast. I'm your host, Suzanne Roberts. I'm the author of It's Deeper Than That and the founder of The Great Reconnection. I am excited to have here with us today as our guest, Helen Park, and I'm excited for you to get to know her story and her evolution. So thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'd like to start with you being the daughter of an immigrant Korean family and some of the textures of what that has meant for you, how it's shaped you. And then we'll lead into how do you liberate yourself from some of that shaping.
Yeah, I'm a daughter of Korean immigrants. I identify as second generation. Sometimes I say I'm a daughter of the Korean diaspora because there's so much held in this story of migration for every family. For my own, they ended up in the Midwest. And so
Mm,
there's a particular experience that I had having my parents were young, they were in their 20s, they had an arranged marriage. They could opt out of the arranged marriage, but I think both of them and their own families were very ambitious and had dreams of going to this land called America and Korea at that time. The US is really seen in this very idealized way. And for a lot of people, that was true. But they were following that dream and ended up in Ohio and Indiana. And so I was raised in Indiana, in Muncie, Indiana. It was a small college town. We were the only Korean family in town, as far as I know. And then there was one Chinese family that lived down the street. There was one Indian family that lived the other way. And then I knew two young Korean girls, a little bit younger than me, who had both been adopted by intercountry adoption. And that's a whole other story. But there was a lot of, and I think a lot of immigrant families share this, but a lot of the kind of living across two cultures, but having parents who didn't know really how to translate that to us of no fault of their own. They were really like very isolated themselves and also very young and being in a relationship, much less a marriage. And so there were all of those dynamics playing out. I have two older brothers. And so, they really worked hard to use assimilation as a protection
mm,
for themselves and for us. And I think that worked in a lot of ways. I'll say, like, in terms of growing up in Indiana, like, I actually feel like I had this very idyllic, protected childhood where I could really be free. Like, I didn't feel constrained by a racialized identity.
mm,
There were a few moments where in my memory, I'm like, oh, that's what that was. At the time, I was really free of that, and I really have to credit my parents for creating that because I do know that they haven't disclosed everything, but I absolutely know that they experienced all kinds of racism and I'm sure just microaggressions left and right. I mean, this was like I was born in 76, and so they arrived in the late 60s. So, yeah, I know that they experienced a lot and a lot that they didn't share. But, I was also like in the family, I was the youngest, the only daughter, and also like the total black sheep of the family. So I was creative. I was from an early age. No one else in my immediate family of origin was, at least not obviously. My brother's really into sports and all the things that sort of socially you're supposed to be into, but I really, when I was like coming into my own as a teenager, was just into like all the weird things that scared them. And as immigrant parents who came,
mm,
sacrificed a lot, really try to protect us. And then I was kind of doing things that looked very risky to them and unsafe. And so that for me is where like another layer on top of like the bicultural translation issue. And then not only that, but I was like very into more alternative, or I hate that word, but like, kind of countercultural things that even kind of maybe a standard middle American would not truly understand. So for them, it was very scary who I was. Yeah, there was a lot of stuff going on, a lot of gender, like Korea is a very patriarchal society. And so my dad, even though he was really trying to be a very like assimilated immigrant, there were unspoken ways that like gender expectations and role expectations were played out, but never explained. So it was very confusing. There was like a reality inside the home, and then you stepped out, and then it was like, but this doesn't match what I was doing inside the home. And we were really having to kind of figure that out on our own, not even with really, much explanation from our parents other than, well, that's just how it is. Yeah, it was very layered, very complex for various reasons. I think culture, gender, being in the Midwest, like all of these things were big contexts that shape things.
Did your parents speak Korean in the home? Do you speak Korean? And did they try to maintain some Korean traditions?
So they spoke Korean to each other. They tried to teach Korean to my brothers and I, but we were very resistant. And also we were surrounded by no one else spoke Korean around us. So it was a really kind of a losing battle. They didn't fight it. They were just kind of, I think they just kind of gave up after a while. I would say I had a very like passive understand because I heard it around me all the time. And they would still speak Korean to us, even though we didn't understand. But somehow, like, like, okay, she's telling me to go practice piano or whatever, So like there were things that were kind of passively passed through, but yeah, we didn't learn. I wish now of course I wish that we had. And I think, in the home, I always talk about how my mom, in addition to working part-time as a nurse, I remember her always making two meals. And she made like the American meal for me and my brothers, and then always had the Korean food for my dad and herself. And so we were like around the food and we heard the language. And every once in a while, like there would be some occasion where they'd put me in a hanbok, which is the Korean dress, traditional dress for some, like multicultural event at the university. But other than that, there wasn't much, it was really, they were working hard. We were all in our lives just trying to be who we were as best we could. And they were very, yeah, they were very busy. So there wasn't a lot of time spent in general together, but certainly not talking about culture or Korea.
And will you talk about your evolution as a sacred artist, is what I would call it. I'm not sure what you call it, but how
Mm.
have you grown throughout the years? And take us to, is it your great uncle or great great uncle? Great uncle.
Great example. Yes, yes. I love this question. So I think like, when I was 16 or 17, I something happened spiritually for me where I really just like lit on fire. And again, it was the time of in Muncie at that time was a really vibrant spiritual culture, even though it wasn't like very explicitly identified as that. But like my closest friend, like her father was an Ayurvedic doctor. They were doing TM all the time. There was like, my friends were kind of like this really wild mix of like anarchists and feminists and just like people who are really into like, Eastern spirituality. So I actually like on my own because I was actually raised Catholic, but I was very drawn to like Buddhism and Native American spirituality. And so I think those two like cosmologies were really exciting to me. And then I don't know, like I think I was just a spiritual person. So I started in theater and I was performing. I loved the theater. It was like my everything. It was just my whole world. And so I was doing Shakespeare, I was directing, I directed Waiting for Godot when I was like 17. I was like, and performing like felt like channeling energy. Like I could, it was like a channeling and I felt it all the time. And that's kind of how from that age, I was like, this is like how I can like build intimacy with people and I can inhabit another life and imagine and feel with my whole body what it's like to be someone else and communicate with other people in this kind of sacred space of the theater that is like the here and now and then it's gone and this is what and there was something very beautiful about that and like just like the visceral energy that you feel with people and I hadn't I was not an extroverted person. I was definitely not like I was I didn't like musical theater. I was like very pretty like introverted. I loved writing. I was writing also. I was running like a little poetry group. We met every Wednesday at the Waffle House. Shout out to the Dead Waffle Society. So, and which actually also I was like watching Dead Poet Society. I really related to the character of Neil, who was like loved acting, like discovered his passion, but had this very oppressive father who just smashed it. And of course, we know tragically he ended his life in the film. But I felt that even, and actively I was having conflict with my parents because my love and my spiritual passion for the theater was just completely not understood or read. It was just made no sense, right? So I felt so driven. And so I ended up, going to a theater conservatory. I was really like, I'm dedicating my life to this. I had even at some point I remember when I was like 16, it said like, if I'll probably, because I'm really dedicating my whole life to my art. And that means that I have to choose between like having a husband and a regular family and the art. And I'm going to choose the art. Like, and so I was like, I'm just going to have to do that. And I don't know why I thought that, but that, I had no models. I was just trying to build it. And so I went to conservatory. I became a little disillusioned with the training. I ended up kind of taking some time off. I was pursuing like performance studies, which is the kind of taking cultural anthropology and theater together and looking at the art of performance more conceptually. I was getting into like film and video, so my creative practice, like it started in performance, but gradually it started kind of like morphing and expanding. And over time, I guess I would describe my creative self as like kind of constantly in evolution because I'm really excited about like all the different ways that we can channel the spiritual through art. And so it kind of evolved eventually into image making and filmmaking and then into like video installation and using like putting video in public spaces also to connect with a public. So there was something always relational about the work also. So I think like, over the years, like there's part of me that was always pushing and always seeking and expanding while at the same time, like personally, like really coming up against this energy, and again, like, and we've spoken about this like in my family where, and I think with a lot of immigrant families where it's like the intention is to protect and like try to get your kid on a good path, but like kind of actually what it was doing was like was was kind of killing my spirit. Like it was really damping down constantly. And there were ways in which that happened that were pretty harmful over the years. And it was emotionally, energetically, it was just really hard to constantly be kind of up against that constant conflict. It began to kind of, it's like begins to seep into your psyche in ways
Mhm.
where even though you're like, I know that this is the right thing, but I keep getting the messages subtly and explicitly that it is absolutely not. And I am actually, that there's embarrassment and there's shame around who I was. And and the belief that I was like lost. I was this confused kid where actually I was like really driven and clear about my path, like so much so. So I guess the next kind of part of it is that kind of over many years took a toll, and also it's hard, it's hard to be an artist. It's like it's the hustle, you're grant writing, you're like if you're not in academia, which I didn't want to follow, like it's just a constant hustle if you're not independently wealthy. So I think some things happened for me personally where I began to like go more into like I needed to heal. I was looking for spiritually like ways where I needed to kind of like replenish, nourish my soul and my spirit. And I turned to spiritual practice more deeply. I went into Buddhist practice very deeply, and that was a really, just finding that refuge was incredible. It was kind of like, this is, also because it's such an applied practice. You don't have to believe, um, you know, a God, but you can take the teachings and apply it directly to life. And that direct experience was something I could really connect with. And so discovering the Buddha Dharma was like really opened things up. It eventually did bring me into going back to school and getting a degree in social work to become a therapist. So and I see kind of this as another, it was a transition where I felt like I needed to fully immerse myself into that world. I stepped back from my creative practice so that I could fully immerse into the training. I ended up also training in family therapy, which I really loved. And again, kind of going into the relational and seeing healing in the field of relationship, while also it was very creative. I mean, there were ways in which I could kind of bring parts of myself back into that. So I did that. I became a therapist. I still do that for work. I love it. After a while, I was like, hey, wait a minute. There's like this whole other person who like I need to get her back. And I found you and we started working together. And I think that when I was writing and the kind of the autobiographical pieces, all of that, it was almost like on the page, I felt like this alchemical energy. It was almost like through the page, those parts of myself seeping through. They were like the fingers, hey, we're bringing you back into yourself. And yeah, so that was happening as I was realizing like I need to recover myself. Also connecting back to the story of my great uncle. So coming to my great uncle Kim Woo-jin, who was a writer. I found out about him when I was 17 on a trip to Korea, where I also was trying to learn the language on that trip. And one of my mom's sisters told me about him. And she said, by the way, did you know that there was an artist in the family? Which like blew my mind because I just thought I was like this weird anomaly. And I could not believe that there was anyone with any creative inclination, like in my immediate family, extended family. So she starts telling me about him, and he was a poet, he was a theater artist, and then he was born in 1897, so he was active in like 1910s, 20s, and he was like this really kind of visionary artist, but who was also under the kind of the relational and domestic oppression of his father, who was a very renowned, they call them young bun, but they were, he was like a government official, oversaw land management and the whole like southwestern region of Korea at that time. And so, being a patriarchal society based in Confucianism, filial piety, Kim Il-jin was the oldest son. So he was expected to take over. He was the next in line to do what his father was doing. But he was an artist and he was really passionate. And he did try to do both. He agreed to marry in the arranged marriage. He had 2 young children, but then he kept having to, he couldn't resist the pull of his soul. And so he would, like, in these acts of rebellion, like one of them, he went off to Tokyo to study at Waseda University in English literature. And that's where he met other young Koreans who were also like, writers and theater artists. And they had this vision to like create a new theater for Korea. This was also during the time of Japanese occupation. So, it was a really brutal occupation. Koreans were in every possible way you imagine, brutal suppression of people that was happening. They had to have Japanese names. They couldn't speak Korean. They were not human. So even as you could be totally educated, totally like brilliant, talented, but you would never go anywhere because you were Korean. And that was also happening. So he had that, and then he had his father. And for him, it became too much. And it's a bit of a kind of a fabled story, but what we believe, what's the story that's believed is that he, with an opera singer, Korean opera singer, Yoon Shin-duk, who herself was kind of like the early prototype of a feminist in Korea. They had a relationship. They were maybe a little romantic, but it wasn't like a big love, but they were both very lost and probably pretty hopeless, but also they both had dreams to go to Europe. We don't really know what happened. They boarded a ship that went from Japan to Korea and disappeared. So the story is that they died by suicide by jumping off the ship. Their bodies were never found, so there's no proof. And there's some like theories out there that somehow they escaped and made it to Europe and changed their names, but we don't know. We don't know what happened to them. So anyway, yeah, so fast forward to now, I'm discovering, I'm reconnecting to him and his life. I did a pilgrimage to Korea a year ago. I have all of what's been published of his writings. I have their novellas, plays, poetry, essays, his diaries, and I'm delving into it. And kind of my road back into my own creative life is also coupled by walking alongside his story and bringing his story into my own, because there's something about the intergenerational healing and the legacy that now feels like I have to do. And so that's kind of where I'm at now.
Will you talk about what you're writing now?
What I'm writing now, I am calling it an autobiographical novel. So it's taking pieces of my story but creating another character. So as I've been writing, it's been more helpful for me to actually write, like give another character, kind of give her my life, right? But also be able to take some liberties in how I write her. And it's interesting, like as I've been doing it that way, I'm like, oh, this is actually very similar to acting when I was like
Absolutely.
playing playing a role, somehow like having that transitional space of another person helps me really access something deeper, having that distance, that aesthetic difference. So that's that part. And then Kim and Jin's story, in a way, it's kind of like I'm trying to actually take, historical facts, but there's also, because there's so much unknown about who he was, I only know him through his work. I don't have a lot of personal stories because anyone who knew him directly has passed. He was very close with my grandfather who passed, but I have to kind of read his stuff to understand him and access him. And so that's the second part of the narrative, is his voice through his work. And then there's a kind of third narrative arc in it, which is I'm calling right now the archive voice. And an archive is always incomplete. We look at archives as documents of what happened, but actually, because there's so many holes in his archive, it's there's something else possible there's something sad in that in what was lost, but then there's also something that really beckons you to channel something else. And that's where, it's so much of the speculative writing comes through in that. And so and the archive voice is also kind of like this more lyrical, like a kind of a more transcendent voice also. It's kind of a shape-shifting voice that will help thread, the main character, like my character and the Kim Woo-jin character together. So that's kind of where the structure is at so far. And right now I'm just in the throes of research and reading and going through lots of material, lots of archives, and piecing it together.
Thank you for sharing all of that. I've had the privilege of getting to read some of your writing, and it's absolutely exquisite. We're going to have to begin to wind down here. I do want to just acknowledge the journey of spiritual expression through creativity that's relational. That's a common theme all along in your whole entire journey. And also, the way that you're talking about writing this book is bringing every part of you together in, also family system healing. And it's just like beautiful. It's very profound and meaningful. And I'm excited for the world to have it when it arrives. I love to ask my guests, what do you think the purpose for life is?
Oh, wow, what a big question. I think the purpose for life is to find your truest expression of love, of the big love that we're all a part of.
Thank you. I love that.
Thank you.
How can people get a hold of you?
A couple ways. I have an email, which is hkpark at, and it's the last part is my website, which is societemai.com. That's French for SOCIETEMAI.com.
Great. Thank you. And that's the name of your website, and that's your email.
Yeah.
Thank you, Helen, so much for being here today. And thank you, listeners, for tuning in today. Subscribe so you can continue to know what's coming. We have guest after guest living life on purpose from varied backgrounds, and we're inspired by each and every one of them. If you have any questions for us, let us know. And thank you for listening. And until next time, this is the Purpose for Life podcast.